not too long ago, I made a video covering some post-punk bands that I think are underrated, and there were several comments to that video talking about how much people hated the genre name post-punk. It doesn't really tell you anything about the music, it just says this came after something else. I can understand this because when you have a genre that encompasses the range of experimentation made by Wire, the somber and dark yet groovy Joy Division, and the reggae-tinged punk of the Slits, all in one genre, what does the term post-punk actually tell you? So I get this argument, but I also feel like you kind of have to pick your battles with badly named genres. There are a lot of them out there. This isn't the biggest offender for me. We're here today to talk about what I think is one of the biggest offenders when it comes to genre names. Despite my thoughts about the genre name, it is also one of my favorite genres because it has some of my very favorite bands. So we're going to cover some bands that I think are literally essential for anybody into any kind of underground rock music. We're going to talk about some of my very favorite albums, including one of my all-time top 10. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism, the alternative to the other music YouTubers. So to get to the heart of this, we're going to explore what alternative is, how it's defined, what falls into it, when did it start, what genres is it related to. It's not a genre. We're going to focus on some crucial early bands, including the band that I think sort of started the direction that led to alternative even being a thing. If you're a subscriber, welcome back. If you're new here, this is Eclecticism, a love letter to music where I explore different music genres and different bands that I love. I like to cover an eclectic range of things, and I like to shine a light on a lot of underground bands. Although in this video, these were underground bands at some point, but you've probably heard of them now. This is also not going to be really a deep dive. I mean, you can't go into some broad genre over the course of 15 to 20 minutes and get all that far into the weeds with it. So this is an introduction. Hopefully in the comments, people can help to fill in some of the gaps about alternative, and I'm sure that I'll cover some more bands that would fall into this later on in other videos. I also just want to acknowledge really quick that this is a fairly US-centric take. And I think that part of this is because it's very informed by a really good book on music, Our Band Could Be Your Life. I really recommend this if you have interest in the bands I'm covering in this video and want to go more in depth with them and also learn some of the other pieces that came together to form this early underground, mostly American rock scene. And there are bands from outside of America that would fall into alternative as well, but a lot of the times they just get categorized differently. They get categorized as jangle pop, or post-punk, or gothic rock. But we'll get more into my gripes later. First, let's explore how alternative music got started. According to Masterclass, alternative rock began in the 1990s. And while the term's associated with the 90s now, we definitely need to go further back to really uncover what makes music part of the alternative genre, not a genre. So let's go all the way back to one of my favorite times in music, the punk revolution of the mid to late 70s. In New York City, artists like Patti Smith, Television, Richard Hell, Ramones, and many others were starting to create new approaches to rock music. These would, depending on who you asked, be called proto-punk, punk, or post-punk. You could trace the roots of the sound back to a combination of sources: the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed, the Stooges, New York Dolls, MC5, Nico, the Modern Lovers, and a lot of the garage rock bands of the 1950s. All of this contributed to both punk and the sounds that would become post-punk. Meanwhile, and shortly after that, you had a more musically unified scene in the UK, which, because of the influence of Sex Pistols and their link to Vivienne Westwood's fashion, also developed into a fashion aesthetic, an anti-fashion that sort of became a fashion, which actually in a lot of ways mirrors the story we're telling today about alternative rock, but we'll come back to that. The first wave of punk bands mostly ended up on major labels, and obviously there were exceptions. Two of the very first American punk bands, Death and Pure Hell, who both predated Sex Pistols, were never offered any major label contracts. That's probably just a coincidence. Anyway, The Damned made one single, New Rose, before signing to a major. The Sex Pistols signed to a major before releasing anything. The first punk band to take DIY to its logical conclusion was the Buzzcocks, with their debut EP, Spiral Scratch. This 4-song EP was released entirely independently, and that's my first recommendation for quintessential alternative rock, even though it's clearly punk. Spiral Scratch was recorded and mixed in a total of 5 hours on the 28th of December, 1976. The band then borrowed money from friends and family to have 1,000 copies of it pressed, and they sold it themselves, through mail order, and at the stores they could get to sell it. Musically, Spiral Scratch is a rough and ready 10 minutes of fast-paced punk that leans a little bit more into pop sensibilities than a lot of the other punk bands this early on. The opener, Breakdown, is less than 2 minutes, but has a really catchy chorus that pulls you in immediately. Despite how quickly it was recorded and how rough all of this is put together, it's a really catchy and innovative for the time 10 minutes of punk music. It shows off the Buzzcocks' knack for melody, but the EP was also a demystification of the record-making process for many. The name, Spiral Scratch, is a reference to what a record actually is, to all of the music simply being carved into this piece of vinyl. The band also demystified the recording process by listing info about the takes and overdubs right on the sleeve next to the song names. The sleeve also sported a minimal design with a white sleeve, one band photo on the front, and nothing but text on the back. And it should be pointed out that this was not the first time a record had been privately pressed. This was an ongoing thing throughout the 60s as well. But the fact that it was coming from a punk band at this particular time and with an association with this particular subculture was sort of an epiphany moment for a lot of people. And this would lead to a lot of new record companies springing up. I really enjoy the roughness of this EP. I feel like it gives you a different side of this band. It's also fun to hear the vocalist who would go on to be in the band Magazine, performing here with the Buzzcocks, and it's the only recorded time that this would happen. They'd go on to make a couple other really quintessential punk releases, Another Music from a Different Kitchen, and Singles Going Steady. To me, Spiral Scratch is up there with those two as punk classics, and it's also the one that I think can be traced to a origin point of this whole alternative subgenre. Because after this, labels started popping up everywhere. You had Rough Trade and Red Rhino in London, Flying Nun in New Zealand, Factory in Manchester, SST in the US. Around the world, music that was not dependent on major labels for distribution was increasingly becoming a part of the music landscape. And just to loop back to the main argument that I'm making throughout this, nobody was really calling it alternative at this time, even as these new record labels were starting to spring up around the world. You started having some use of the word independent. And again, this was referring to the labels, it wasn't referring to independent rock or indie rock. All clear so far? Good, because it's just going to get more confusing. In the United States and Canada during the 1980s, you had a new phenomenon of many college radio stations focusing on independent music. Just like indie initially meaning independent labels, college radio initially referred to the music played on these eclectic channels. And these weren't limited in the same ways commercial radio stations were. You'd have country alongside punk. Over time, college rock started being used to describe a certain intersection of sounds, though. Rock music that was connected to both the underground, but also had a certain pop sensibility, something that someone in college might want to put on the radio. A quintessential early example of college rock is REM, from Athens, Georgia, a band who was technically on an independent label, IRS. But IRS was actually distributed by a major label, A&M, so the extent to which they were truly an indie band is questionable. What's not questionable is that REM had an almost immediate impact on the rock music that was coming out of these underground labels. Their first EP, Chronic Town, that one right there, is an easy 10 out of 10 classic. Just a really confident debut right out of the gate. Their debut album, Murmur, was REM's album of the year in 1983, and it was pretty uncommon for that to go to an independent release at this time. Then they had a really good run of 5 albums on IRS Records that showed the band evolving and trying out different things. With each one, their audience got a little bit bigger and moved a little bit closer to the mainstream until they started breaking out on their 5th album, Document. Shortly after that, they went to a major label where their fan base kept growing, but despite their ongoing growth and the fact that they were doing different things with each album, there were certain elements of their playing that went on to form a new genre called jangle pop. Murmur, REM's first album, is a classic. From the opening song, Radio Free Europe, REM is doing something that, when you compare it to the music of the time, feels fresh and new. The driving and melodic rhythm section, the harmonizing vocals provided by Mike Mills, Peter Buck's iconic folkish guitar playing, which was inspired by bands like Soft Boys and Big Star, and of course, the singular voice of Michael Stipe. On this first album, Stipe was often not really writing lyrics at all, and definitely didn't want anyone to decipher what he was saying. He was more interested in capturing a sound than in providing a specific meaning. And there are some lines on here that, even after countless listens, I still have no idea what he's saying. In fact, in later interviews, sometimes he didn't know what he was saying. Given the mumbled delivery and the intentional obscurity, it's strange to say that this is an immensely confident debut, but that is how it feels. They've blended their influences in a way that feels new, but also fully realized, to the extent that by their next album, they'd already be evolving from this signature sound. So I cover a lot of genres, I cover a lot of albums on this channel, but this is a top 10 album for me. There should be statues of the pile of kudzu on the album cover to remind us how good this album is. And as far as I'm concerned, the first 5 REM albums are all 10 out of 10. They're without a doubt a really important reference point in alternative rock. But they're not alternative rock, they're jangle pop or occasionally power pop. While REM was getting started down in Athens, Georgia, the New York scene continued to evolve. After punk, post-punk, and new wave had all kicked off, there was the no wave scene. I briefly covered this before, but in case you don't watch every single video I make, no wave was an anti-art, avant-garde movement in New York City. It often ignored song structures, it was often dissonant and antagonistic towards the audience. Basically, these kids were making a goddamn racket. Out of this no wave scene came a few musicians who would have a major impact on the development of rock music as a whole. Lee Ranaldo, Kim Gordon, and Thurston Moore were involved in the art and no wave scenes, with Ranaldo performing with the iconic avant-garde composer and no-wave artist Glenn Branca. He left Glenn Branca's band to form Sonic Youth with Kim Gordon and Thurston Moore in 1981, a band that would arguably have as big of an influence on rock music as REM. Now, I know that in modern times their reputation's been totally ruined because they put Nardwuar in a headlock back in the 90s. And someone always makes a comment about this when people talk about Sonic Youth on the internet.
You fucking piece of shit! You broke it! I was in prison for you!
But if Nardwuar got over the headlock and interviewed them again, even giving Lee Ranaldo a hug, maybe we can get over it too.
I don't remember attacking you.
You attacked me and you broke this record! No, not again, Lee Ranaldo!
The first noise rock, no-wave era of the band peaked for me with Bad Moon Rising, which was full of noisy experiments and songs that don't follow any traditional structures, but that uses this sonic experimentation to create ominous atmospheres, much of it made from droning, tortured guitars, and lingering in strange soundscapes long enough that they become almost ambient. This album came out in 1985, which puts this before shoegaze, before drone metal. With this band definitely not making either of those, but pointing towards them while shrugging and then doing 20 other things. It feels to me like a primordial puddle where the life forms that would grow into most kinds of modern rock were starting to take shape. But their fourth album, Evil, is where everything comes together in a way that's a bit more accessible. Like most of these bands, I feel that looking at their work when they're still firmly underground and then comparing it to their work after they started connecting to a wider audience shows us a lot about how alternative music was starting to create its own version of the mainstream. Evil was reviewed by a lot of mainstream sources, including People magazine, who referred to the album as an oral equivalent of a toxic waste dump. This actually fits surprisingly well, with lyrics pointing towards murder and tragic accidents, guitars being played in strange ways they've never been played before. It's sort of like Sonic Youth were determined to stick to the rock band archetype of drums, guitar, bass, but to see just how far they could stretch that archetype outside of the confines of the usual song structures. Moore and Ranaldo, in particular, would physically alter guitars, getting cheap guitars at the stores and doing surgery on them essentially to make them sound different from any other guitar. This would lead to songs that could really only be played on one strangely altered guitar that they had, and so during early concerts they'd often be switching between tons of different instruments and having to take them all on tour. Evil was a significant turning point, but there were more past that. For a lot of people, later albums like Daydream Nation or Goo would really be the transition point where they started paying attention. For me, they've been doing interesting things all the way back to Bad Moon Rising, and everything through the 2000s and the end of the band was really interesting. But while REM and Sonic Youth were snowballing and growing their audiences in different parts of the country, there were some new things happening in Minnesota as well. If REM is an example of how to do everything right, the Replacements are possibly the opposite. From Minneapolis, Minnesota, they started out as Dog Breath, and were influenced by a combination of classic rock, classic pop, and punk. Their first album, Sorry Ma Forgot to Take Out the Trash, is largely hardcore punk, but it already illustrates Paul Westerberg's lyrical abilities and the emotive quality of his voice to make their music emotional and relatable. The Replacements stuck with hardcore for a bit further than their first album. in part because of the influence of their fellow Minnesotans, Husker Du. Husker Du was from St. Paul, and for a while had the reputation as the world's fastest band. Around 1980, they were both in healthy competition, with each band winning some of the battles. Husker Du was hoping for a record contract with Twin Tone Records, but it was offered to the Replacements instead. The Replacements wanted an opening gig for Johnny Thunders, and Husker Du snuck in and took it. Both bands also forged early identities within punk and hardcore, but refused to be limited by those scenes. Really, both bands deserve a whole video focusing just on them, and you could go through all of their albums. There's a lot of great stuff here, but I'm going to just focus on what I think are some key works from each. Husker Du created a monumental work with their 1983 double album, Zen Arcade. This was a concept album about a boy leaving home and discovering the world, but the plot was never really the focal point for me. The way the band blends their previous hardcore punk sound with a range of other influences is. Despite the fact that with this album, they're still very much within hardcore, you can picture some of the song, like Never Talking to You Again, being a radio single. A lot of the other tracks, like What's Going On, have clear pop underpinnings that show what the band could become, but it's still way too loud for your average radio listener. There's a whole lot of feedback and noise in the mixes. You could say a lot of the same things about the Replacements' 1984 masterpiece, Let It Be. This was their third album, and it had some songs connecting to their punk roots, while others point towards a broader sound, like the opener, I Will Dare. I Will Dare is a perfect song, with a chorus you'll never forget once you've heard it, clever and self-deprecating lyrics that captures the essence of the Replacements succinctly. It's also a love song, the kind of sincere and sweet lyrics you wouldn't often find in punk at the time. R.E.M's Peter Buck is playing the lead guitar on the track, by the way. Let It Be also includes Androgynous, a beautiful ballad about accepting others, which prominently features a piano. And then alongside all these amazing pop jams, it has Gary's Got a Boner, because the Replacements never took anything very seriously. So these were what I consider the starting points for both of these bands, with merging accessible pop sounds with their underground roots. They're some of my favorites, but with both bands, they had impressive runs that would continue through most of the 80s. Husker Du did become more accessible as the years went on, but they never really lost the loudness or moved away from the underground completely. New Day Rising, Flip Your Wig, and Candy Apple Grey are all very much worth exploring. With later Replacements albums, after Bob Stinson left the band, they really do move quite far away from hardcore. However, both Tim and Pleased to Meet Me are standouts of alternative rock, or more accurately, power pop, maybe rock and roll. So to go back to my earlier comment about the Replacements, they had numerous high-profile gigs, including Saturday Night Live, that they completely bombed, often because they went on stage completely drunk, or because they just chose to antagonize the audience that night. There were lots of situations where somebody from a record company or an important audience was there, and they performed one of their worst shows ever. They had an antagonistic attitude towards authority figures of any kind, and their second album, Hootenanny, has an opening song that's literally an improvised studio piss take, just because they were trying to annoy their producer. And that's where the album title came from. They signed to a major label, but when they were convinced to make a video, they literally just filmed footage of a stereo playing their song. They kept making antagonistic moves towards the record label, even while writing brilliant music, and this led to them never really transcending the music underground. MTV didn't have much to do with them. Husker Du also transitioned to a major label, and this starts to raise the question of, when is alternative music no longer alternative? Does it have anything to do with whether it's on a major label, with whether it's getting played on the radio, or is there something else about the essence of the music? And if so, can anybody actually say what it is? By the time Husker Du recorded 1986's Candy Apple Grey, they were balancing their fast-paced pop punk with emotive rock, all with a greater focus on melody than they had at the beginning. Their work provided a blueprint, or at least a major inspiration, on later bands like Nirvana and even Green Day, for how effectively they balanced the sounds of the underground with pop songwriting. So we've covered some early bands in the story of alternative rock. There are obviously lots more to get to, but let's do a quick summary of what happened to all of these bands. Well, Husker Du didn't make it through the 80s. Interpersonal conflicts were a problem, along with financial conflicts. And these were in a large part created by the decision they'd made early on to assign songwriting credits on a song-by-song basis. The Replacements lasted slightly longer, at least sort of. They collectively struggled with alcohol and drug abuse, and founding member Bob Stinson was no longer in the band as of August 1986. The band can't get the story straight about whether he quit or was fired. The band released a few more albums. They never really did get their shit together though, and by the time they finally decided to start playing by some of the rules, it felt like their moment had just passed, like they just missed it. The final Replacements album was basically a Paul Westerberg solo album, and then they just sort of faded out. The year they fully faded out was 1991, which coincidentally was a year that REM topped the charts, and had one of the most popular albums of the year, Out of Time. Both Sonic Youth and REM were a massive influence on music in the 90s, and both were still massive forces throughout that decade. REM had late career masterpieces like 1992's Automatic for the People, 1996's New Adventures in Hi-Fi, and the massively underrated Reveal from 2001. Sonic Youth had a consistently strong run throughout the whole rest of their career, really, as rock music took more and more cues from the band's experimental spirit. Some of their later career highlights for me are 1992's Dirty, 1995's Washing Machine, 2002's Murray Street, and 2006's Rather Ripped. It feels like REM in particular doesn't get talked about that much anymore, but they really should. They're an example in a lot of ways of how to do things right as a band. They split the royalties equally. They seem to have a very democratic process about figuring things out within the band. They also were able to steadily build popularity from starting out as a sort of cult band, developing an underground audience, gradually transitioning into the mainstream, and then hitting the top of the charts and just sort of riding that wave for about a decade. Their sound kept evolving for 3 decades and 15 albums. When founding member Bill Berry left the band in 1997, they carried on as a 3-piece. Then they amicably decided to call it a day in 2011, just a few years after being nominated into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Peter Buck, Mike Mills, and Michael Stipe all continue to be involved in music and art, and apparently Michael Stipe is getting close to the end of his first solo album. And Sonic Youth might as well be a shadow version of REM, just as influential on the rougher and noisier side of rock music, as REM was to the more accessible side of it. Both bands would cast very long shadows, both would have 30-year careers, and both would release 15 albums with a variety of side projects. Then, both bands would dissolve within 2 months of one another at the end of 2011. Sadly, the breakup of Sonic Youth was not an amicable one. Kim Gordon and Thurston Moore had been married throughout most of the band's existence, and when the couple's marriage fell apart after Thurston Moore had an affair, that was the end of the band. But out of all the individual musicians in this whole video, who's making the best music right now? It's Kim Gordon, who just released her second solo album, an experimental hip-hop art rock album called The Collective. At 71, she's still finding new ways to experiment with music. So this is obviously a partial story. I don't have time in this one video to get through the whole story of alternative rock, or to even fully make my argument for why alternative rock is a terrible genre name and shouldn't be used. For that, we're gonna need to dig into the later 80s and most of the 90s as well, which I'll be doing next time. If you can't tell, the bands in this video are some that I'm very passionate about, so I really didn't want to rush through anything. I want to give each of these bands a little bit of time, and to really tell you why you should pay attention to them. So the next video will be picking up right where this one left off, looking at some really important bands from the late 80s and some of the key albums from them, and then also looking at what happens to alternative in the 90s, which is really when the term starts getting used, even though it's now applied to a lot of bands that came before. Again, I said it was kind of confusing. There is a playlist to go along with this video, which will cover the bands that I went over in this video, and it'll expand to cover the later bands when the next video comes out. So keep an eye on that playlist link. Thanks for watching Eclecticism. This channel is a love letter to music. If you like what you see here, check us out on Instagram. If you want to see more special episodes like interviews with bands, then donate a few pounds on the Coffee page. And most importantly, let me know in the comments who you think are the most important alternative bands that should be checked out, or what you think about the genre as a whole. I'll see you next time.